one family, the power and speed of stock car racing is all they've ever known.
As long as I can remember, racing has been our vocation, our hobby, our desire. It's a big thrill. It was the high for Richard Petty.
They called him the King, and he won more races than any other driver ever. But Richard Petty is just one of 4 generations of drivers in the Petty clan. His father, Lee, was the first Petty to be called a champion.
Lee will be remembered as one of the pioneers of the sport and a truly great race driver.
While the Petty men risked their lives to run the family business, it was the Petty women who had to be strong enough to hold the family together.
I think we're a different breed, and maybe it's because that our men made us this way. We know the price we pay on a Sunday afternoon if something happens to them.
Danger couldn't slow the Pettys. The dynasty continued with Richard's son Kyle, but the expectations on Kyle to become the next king were overwhelming.
From the time he was a little boy, people were always patting him on the head and saying, "You're going to be just like your daddy when you grow up."
I'm not Richard Petty, okay? My name's Kyle Petty. I don't have to win X number of races or championships to be content with who I am.
The rift between Richard and Kyle threatened to ruin the Petty family business.
It was, who's going to stay? Does Richard Petty stay or does Kyle Petty stay?
It would fall to the 4th generation of Petty drivers, Kyle's son Adam, to pull the family back together.
When he was at a racetrack, he just lit up and he shined and he was happy.
Adam was poised to lead racing's first family into the 21st century.
My cell phone rang and he said there'd been an accident and that it wasn't good.
The dynasty was shaken to its core, but the Petty family endures.
Never put a question mark where God has put a period. He's got a plan.
This is the Petty family, beyond the glory. The speed, the money, the sudden danger waiting at every turn. NASCAR is America's #1 spectator sport. But when it started, it wasn't much more than a handful of wild men racing their family cars on dirt tracks. Lee Petty was one of racing's pioneers. In the late 1930s, the Depression was winding down in most of the country, but not in Level Cross, North Carolina. Hard times were only getting harder for Lee and Elizabeth Petty, and their 2 sons, Richard and Maurice.
We grew up in this community here in Level Cross. We lived on a dirt road. We had no electricity, no running water, no telephone.
The Pettys could not afford their own home. Instead, they shared a crowded house with Elizabeth's parents.
I was born and raised in this house right here beside the shop. That was my mother's home place, and so we lived with grandmother and granddaddy and all the brothers and sisters.
For the Pettys, life was one hardship after another.
I remember waking up one morning and I couldn't walk, and the doctor come out and see me, and they sent me right down to Duke. And I remember being in the Duke hospital, being left down there by myself, and I couldn't get used to that.
Maurice was stricken with polio.
At that time, we didn't know whether he was going to live or die or whether he was going to ever walk again.
I was one of the lucky ones. I got over it enough to where I could get out and get around.
After World War II ended, good times still did not reach Level Cross. To feed his family, Lee turned to the one industry that was booming in the hills of North Carolina: illegal moonshine.
He probably had a little bit to do with it from time to time as he was growing up and, you know, before we got into the racing business.
I can't say that he made any, but he did haul in the trucking business a little bit. That's the reason he always had a fast car.
In North Carolina, the roar of the moonshiners' supercharged engines filled the night. By day, when these men weren't running from the law, they raced each other.
The people that had the moonshine cars, they was constantly racing each other to see who had the best, fastest car.
It was only a matter of time before someone figured out how to make money from these impromptu races. Bill France, a mechanic and part-time racer, had a vision for the future. In 1949, in Daytona Beach, Florida, he founded the National Association of Stock Car Auto Racing. That same year, Lee Petty was the runner-up to NASCAR's first champion.
he decided he could make a living out of it. He started saying, okay, if we got enough money to run a race car and eat and get enough money to go to the next race, then that's all he was doing with the trucking business, so he just made it work.
It's Lee Petty and Buck Baker battling it out for the top spot.
While Lee was off racing, it was Elizabeth who kept the Petty family together.
He would go off this way or that way, and she'd bring him back in and say, okay, you know, we've got to make a living out of this. You can't be out gambling your money, or you can't be out doing what you want to do. We've got to have enough money to, you know, pay the bills or get the food or get the kids to enough clothes to go to school.
Richard, his brother Maurice, and their cousin Dale Inman went to all of Lee's races. To save money, Lee used the boys as his pit crew.
I think he had to be at least 18 years old to be in the pit. And, you know, we was 11 or 12 years old. We'd see somebody come and look like they could run us out. We'd hide, we'd get under the car, we'd get in the car, we'd go in the bathroom, whatever it was, to stay away from people.
And here comes a wheel without a car.
At one time, these cars were stock cars.
And here's the car that lost the wheel, way behind.
Well, there wasn't a whole lot to be done because you didn't have much to work with. And, you know, you're talking about airing the tires and keeping the windshield clean, keeping it gassed up. I'd have to clean up the car after it would run a race, or clean parts, sweep the floor. Richard did the same thing. Nobody knew anything about racing then. He just learned from the ground up.
While his sons learned how to build race cars, Lee Petty learned how to win races.
Now we have a battle for the lead between Tim Flock in 91 and Lee Petty in 42.
He was a strong competitor. He's hard to beat. It was a push-shove, bang-up type show when you went out there. He just wasn't a quitter.
Look out!
In 1959, Lee Petty and the boys ran at the first super speedway race in NASCAR history, the inaugural Daytona 500.
Who in the world would have think that after 500 miles that the first and second place car would come by side by side? And sure enough, here they come, the very last lap. There was 3 cars went across. One of them was a lap down. But my father and Johnny Beauchamp were running side by side.
It took Bill France Sr. and the judges 3 days to decide who actually won the race.
We didn't have a photo finish set up to record it.
The race wasn't even on TV, but Bill France found the fan who had filmed the finish, and it proved that Lee was the winner.
After that, we had photo finish equipment set up.
The sport had come a long way from the days of dirt tracks and moonshine whiskey. In 1958, 21-year-old Richard Petty was ready to race himself. His father was generous in giving advice to Richard, but blood ties meant little on the track when both Pettys were racing to win.
We was running a race in Atlanta, Georgia on a mile track. He got all confused with the scoring and stuff, and they flagged me the winner. And they come out and they said, I think somebody's protested. Sure enough, it was Daddy. He protested and said they had flagged the wrong guy, and they went back and checked the cards, and sure enough, he had beaten me.
Never before in American sports had both the father and his son been at the top of their sport at the same time. But it wouldn't be long before Richard would leave his father and the rest of the racing world far behind. Coming up, a father and son both faced disaster at the Daytona 500.
Went to the hospital, and they said, you know, he might live, he might not.
And later, a mother tries to steer her son away from the racetrack.
I wanted him to go to college and pharmacy school.
While Lee Petty was becoming one of NASCAR's first great champions, his son Richard was learning the trade too. In fact, Richard had been driving the family car ever since he was big enough for his foot to reach the pedal.
Growing up in the country, wasn't nothing to jump in the car and go down and see grandmother, and other than needing something from the store, I'd just jump in the car and drive out. That was probably a bigger deal for me than going out with the girls.
But one girl did slow him down.
His brother was dating one of my really close friends, and lots of times after we'd go to ball games, he would take her home, and they'd always give me a ride because we were neighbors. One night when after a ball game, he was taking us both home, and Richard tagged along, and he said, "Hey, I'm Richard Petty," and I said, "Well, hey, I'm Linda Owens," and from then on, we just started seeing each other here and there.
Richard knew that a career in NASCAR would take him away from level cross, but he didn't want to leave Linda behind.
I had 1 year left of school, but at that time, in 1959, it was not an uncommon thing for young people to slip off to South Carolina, Virginia, wherever, and get married.
I think it was 3 or 4 months after that before we ever told anybody we were married, but it was one of the deals, too, that I was just starting to race, and I was really busy.
We started a family right off. In one June, we had Kyle, and the next June, we had Sharon, and then a couple years later, we had Lisa. By the time I was 20, 21 years old, I had 3 small children.
With Richard away on the circuit, it wasn't easy for Linda and the kids. Kyle grew up without a 9-to-5 dad.
He was gone 2 or 3 days a week. I was under the assumption everybody's father was gone 2 or 3 days a week, so I looked at that as being normal.
I'm sure that through the years of their growing up, he missed some things. He missed ball games, he missed dance recitals, and all the things the kids would be involved in from time to time.
The family's only quality time together was on the road. Linda and the kids spent every summer on the racing circuit. But even at the track, Richard had little time for his family.
We used to have to wait a lot, and we'd sit in the infield and they'd be out and in the car. And every time they'd open the door and the light would stay on, and I don't know how many times he finally would come to a car for us to go home, and the battery would be dead. We'd have to find somebody to jump us off so we could go home.
By 1960, both Richard and his father Lee were at the top of the circuit.
I ran a lot of races with him, but I never competed with him. I was competing against everybody else because at that particular time we had no sponsors. So everything that he did or I did was monies to put into the race car so we could get better for the next race. And it was a matter of survival more than us being in competition with each other. Together we tried to beat everybody.
The time Richard and Lee spent racing together was short-lived. In 1961, during a series of qualifying rounds the day before the Daytona 500, there was a devastating accident.
We had a 100-mile qualifying race, and I went over the bank in the number 1 corner, and then in the second race, my father went over the bank in 3 and 4. I didn't see the accident. I was in the hospital, and they were picking glass out of my eyes. I heard them announce on the loudspeaker that Lee Petty went out of the racetrack. Went to the hospital, and they said, you know, he might live, he might not. And in fact, 2 or 3 days, they didn't do nothing to try to keep him alive. And then once they found out he was going to live, then they started working on him.
Lee didn't get out of the hospital for 4 months, and he left with a permanent limp. Although he attempted to drive again, he had lost his nerve. The accident at Daytona ended Lee Petty's racing career, but the Petty family was far from finished.
It fell on my brother and myself to run the business. That was our livelihood. We had to do something. We couldn't just say, okay, we're going to quit. Now what do?
We had to make ends meet, so we went to work going racing, and Richard was coming into his own.
43 Plymouth takes the checkered flag going away.
With Richard driving and Maurice building the engines, the Petty brothers were an unstoppable team. Lee had left the family business in good hands.
The first super speedway race I won was Daytona in 1964. And that was a big, big deal for us because Daytona was the biggest racetrack. My father had already won there. And it was the beginning of the Richard Petty era. Once you win Daytona, they start paying attention.
After winning at Daytona, Richard went on to become the 1964 Grand National Champion. But in 1965, Richard's sponsor, Plymouth, had a falling out with NASCAR. In the dispute, Richard sided with Plymouth. Rather than defending his championship on the NASCAR circuit, he turned to drag racing. Even in drag racing, the Petty spirit was tested again.
We had an accident somewhere in Georgia, and we took off the line and something broke, and I ran over in the crowd and hurt some people and killed, I think, an 8-year-old boy. And that was a very, very emotional time for us. It took a lot of counseling and a lot of faith just to work your way through that. You got to sit down and say, oh, you know, the good Lord works in mysterious ways, and you know, we don't see the plus in this, but somewhere, hopefully, there is a plus.
Although the tragedy haunted Richard, he never thought about quitting. Richard was born to drive, and by racing cars, he would turn his family into a dynasty. Coming up, the fans crown Richard Petty the king of NASCAR.
You beat Richard Petty very much, very long, then you become the enemy of the fan.
And later, a father-son feud threatens to bring down the Petty dynasty. In 1964, Richard Petty won his first NASCAR championship. But an accident the next year claimed the life of an 8-year-old fan. The wreck caused Richard to take stock in his career.
Here's an 8-year-old kid just coming to enjoy watching the run, and you take his life. You don't ever want to forget stuff. You just have to learn to handle it.
In 1966, Richard rededicated himself to his sport and to his fans. He started the season right, winning the Daytona 500.
Daytona 500 is the race of the year. It's our Super Bowl, Kentucky Derby, World Series, all rolled up into one for us. And we do it at the beginning of the year. So if you win the race at Daytona, it lasts all year long.
Richard's victory sparked a string of success unprecedented in the sport. No one had ever won more than 18 races in a season. In 1967, Richard won 27, 10 of them in a row. To this day, it is the greatest season a race car driver has ever had. Richard had become the king, but he never lost his common touch.
I don't really remember where I signed my first autograph. I just hit it off with the fans. I love the fans, and it was just an automatic deal. I think I was overwhelmed that anybody would want to stop and talk to me. I mean, here I am just driving a race car, and somebody wants your autograph. And I said, man, ain't that great?
Richard handled all the demands of his career with grace. But being the king was never as easy as he made it look off the track or on it. In 1976, at the Daytona 500, David Pearson pushed Richard into a final lap showdown that became one of NASCAR's most memorable finishes.
Come down the last lap, he passed me up the back stretch. I pass him in 3 and 4, but I don't clear him. I get up beside him.
But he didn't get quite all the way around me, and when he came up, his right rear came up and hit my left front, and of course both of us spinning around.
Get within about 20 yards of the start-finish line, it bogs down. He hits the outside wall, comes down across pit lane. Well, he'd hit the inside wall, except somebody come down pit road, straightens him up, and he goes out, and he winds up winning the race.
That was a good one, and I guess I enjoyed it a little bit more than he did, you know, because I kept my car going.
Between 1963 and 1977, Pearson and Petty finished 1 and 2 63 times. It was a 15-year rivalry that was great for the sport. But a competitor like Pearson only increased the pressure on Richard to make it to the winner's circle. The stress of staying at the top began to take its toll on Richard Petty's health.
He had some ulcers in the stomach, and they had healed. Left some scar tissue that was blocking the lower intestine, and he would eat, and sometimes after he would eat, he would get just extremely sick.
Winter of '78, I guess, had about 40% of my stomach removed.
It ended up being just a major kind of surgery. I'm quite sure he told you he was fine and felt great, but that's a man thing.
In 4 weeks, was back in the race car. 6 weeks, I went to Daytona and won the race. So you didn't let a little something about taking half your stomach out, you didn't let that slow you down.
Richard wouldn't slow down his career for anything. And his son Kyle was growing up missing his father. While Richard was on the circuit, Kyle spent his teenage years away from the racetrack. He was a gifted athlete and a talented musician, but his father was never around to share in his son's achievements.
He grew up with me racing, gone so much, and probably missed a little bit of my loving him as far as really showing it. It's not that I don't love him. I'm just not as affectionate. I probably got it on the inside. I just don't show it on the outside.
When Kyle graduated from high school, he had a difficult choice to make. His father took it for granted that he would go into the family business. But his mother, Linda, was quietly hoping that Kyle would choose a safer way of making a living.
I wanted him to go to college and pharmacy school.
And I said, okay, let me go drive a race car. And if I don't like it, then I'll go off to school.
In 1979, Kyle Petty won his debut race at the Daytona International Speedway. His career choice was suddenly crystal clear.
I was 18. I was the youngest guy to win at that time. And, you know, once you go to Daytona and you run and you have any success at all, then you're hooked.
Kyle was trying to emerge from his father's shadow. The family was proud, but Linda's fears were doubled with both husband and son on the track.
When they were both on the track, it was hard. I was concerned for Richard, but always concerned for Kyle, because with your child, I don't care if you live to be 100 and your child is 80, you're going to feel some responsibility.
Linda was not the only woman worrying about Kyle. In 1977, Kyle met Patty Huffman. 2 years later, during Kyle's rookie year of racing, they were married.
When you fall in love with somebody and you marry them, whether they're a race car driver or a salesman or a doctor or a pharmacist, you tend to support whatever they set their hand to do.
From 2 generations of Petty women who had already been through it all, Patty learned how to deal with sending her husband off to work every week, never knowing if he would come back alive.
It's very difficult, and if anybody tells you it's not true. I learned that you don't let people see the real you know, or your fears and doubts and worries and anxieties. You just keep them within inside.
I think it's always harder on the wives and on the family than it is on the drivers, no matter what, whether you're having a good year or a bad.
The father and your husband is not there.
I think we're a different breed, and maybe it's because that our men made us this way. We know the price we have to pay, the price we pay on a Sunday afternoon if something happens to them.
While the constant threat of their husband's death hung over the women, it wasn't always easy for the men either. For Kyle, there was tremendous pressure to win every week simply because he was Richard Petty's son.
From the time he was a little boy, people were always patting him on the head and saying, "You're going to be just like your daddy when you grow up, just like your daddy." He loves his father, but he is not Richard Petty. And Kyle is very individual, and I think that was his intention in his life.
Richard Petty was not a clone of Lee Petty. You know, they were 2 totally different people. And I'm obviously not a clone of Richard Petty. We were entirely different people who just happened to love the same sport of auto racing.
Richard was a hard act to follow, and Kyle was struggling with the burden of trying to live up to a legend.
I'm not Richard Petty, okay? My name's Kyle Petty, okay? He's my father. I couldn't be any more proud of him. He's had a tremendous career. At the same time, I don't have to win X number of races or championships to be content with who I am.
Coming up, a father-son rivalry threatens to tear the family business apart. It's the keys to the family.
We'll return in a moment.
Kyle Petty, 3rd generation of the Petty family, was trying to live up to his family's reputation of winning. But Kyle was torn. He loved to race, but he also loved to sing. And he was good enough to be a pro at that too.
Music is something that I love.
Oh, King Richard, you runner's dream, the swiftest of outlaws I've ever seen.
I was looking for an outlet to be able to enjoy myself and just relax. But I wanted to keep it as something I enjoyed, not as something that became a job.
What can you say about
Kyle's commitment to racing was something that others doubted. His interest in music was misunderstood and became a cause for criticism on the circuit. As a driver, he wasn't taken seriously.
People began to say, well, is this what you want to do, or do you want to drive a race car? To Kyle, the music side of his life was no different than Dale Earnhardt likes to go hunting. The music was Kyle's golf and hunting.
Big knock on me as a race car driver is I've always tried other things, but I always told people I didn't want to get to be 90 years old and look back on my life and say, you know, I had an opportunity to do this, but I didn't.
The Petty family's high expectations for Kyle's racing career soon gave way to disappointment. After his initial victory in 1979, he would not win another race for 6 years. There was also disappointment for Richard. The King was no longer winning. Fewer wins meant less money, and Petty Enterprises was going broke. The company, which always prided itself on family, no longer had enough money to keep both father and son on the circuit.
We got to a point financially at Petty Enterprises where it was, who's going to stay? Does Richard Petty stay or does Kyle Petty stay? And at that point in time, with the amount of experience I had, I didn't have enough experience to go get another ride somewhere. My father, in turn, had enough experience that everybody wanted Richard Petty to drive for.
In 1984, Richard Petty shocked the racing world. He left Petty Enterprises to race under the banner of Mike Curb, a record executive from Los Angeles. It was under Curb's ownership that Richard won his 200th and final race on July 4th, 1984, at the Firecracker 400. Back home, Kyle was struggling to keep the family business alive. With his father gone and no recent victories to his name, Kyle found that Petty Enterprises could no longer afford to keep even one car on the track. In 1985, he signed a deal to race for the Wood brothers, longtime rivals of the Petty family.
It made me feel kind of strange because he was going to basically competition. But on the other hand, I know he's going to a good operation with good people that'll take care of him. It was kind of mixed emotions that it did happen.
When Kyle moved on, the only family member left at Petty Enterprises was Maurice, the man who had built the engines for 198 of Richard's victories. Suddenly, Maurice had no one to build engines for. Not only had Petty Enterprises broken up, but in a sense, so had the Petty family.
When Kyle finally left, that story left me without a job.
It was a big deal. I mean, here you had Petty Enterprises over the years had been the winningest operation. They'd won more championships, they'd won more races, they'd done everything in racing, and then all of a sudden it's just folding its tent.
The King would not let everything he had built disappear. In 1986, Richard left Mike Curb and returned home. His cousin Dale joined him to help rebuild the company, but Richard's days in the winner's circle were over.
Linda myself always had a deal. She'd say, you know, how much longer are you going to do this? I said, okay, as long as I'm having fun, I'm going to drive. And 88, we had a spectacular accident at Daytona, and the thing turned over 4 or 5 times, and I went to the infirmary, and I looked up, and I could tell she'd been crying. She was mad. And she looked down and said, "Are we having fun?"
King Richard faced the fact that his reign was coming to an end.
Linda and myself and the family, we'd had a lot of discussions on how we're going to do it and when we're going to do it. We decided that, you know, we needed to come up with something. That's when we come up with a fan appreciation tour. We had thousands of people to turn out to these places, and it made me feel really good that the people knew Richard Petty.
And this sport is where it's at today because of Richard Petty, the way he handled himself, the wins, the championships. I mean, he carried this sport to a whole new level.
Richard Petty and the Petty family have been so instrumental in NASCAR and been a part of NASCAR that, you know, I don't know if it'd be the same without them.
Dale Earnhardt succeeded Richard at the top of the circuit, but King Richard was still as popular as ever.
Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Petty.
In 1992, on the eve of Richard's last race, 50,000 of his closest fans turned out for his farewell party at the Georgia Dome in Atlanta.
I remember that day in Atlanta, 92, that we were all crying that last time he crawled in the car. But it was mixed tears. Tears of joy for ourselves and tears of sadness for him.
Richard's last race was one of his most memorable.
We started the race and somewhere hadn't run very far and got in a wreck and the car caught on fire. Anyhow, they brought it in the pit. The boys, you know, they didn't want me to be sitting there when the race was over. and here come my wife and my 3 daughters. We all cried together for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then they come in and said, "Car's ready." So I got out, got back in the car, and started grinning again.
Richard's racing days were over, and Kyle was alone on the circuit. From 1985 through 1996, he had been away from Petty Enterprises and had made his own name as a top driver with 8 victories and 167 top 10 finishes. In 1997, Kyle finally returned home, but he didn't do it for himself. There was a new Petty on the horizon, a 4th generation who was the heir apparent to the family dynasty.
Adam wanted to be a Winston Cup race car driver. He came along after me, and he was very drawn to it.
Kyle wanted to start building a team of his own so that he would have a place for Adam.
The single-mindedness about racing that had driven Lee and Richard Petty may have skipped a generation in Kyle, but it was reborn in his son, Adam.
Even as a very young child, he was very dedicated. It's what he set his heart to do. He didn't mind the time that it took to put into racing. Kyle and I wanted to give him every opportunity to succeed at what he did.
Coming up, a 4th generation Petty becomes an instant star on the track.
What's it feel like to win the big one, man?
The goal was to take that team as Adam's team and bring it to Winston Cup.
And the family is tested when tragedy strikes on a New Hampshire speedway. Kyle Petty had struggled for years being the son of the racing legend, Richard Petty. But for Kyle's son Adam, becoming the 4th generation Petty driver was all he ever wanted.
When Adam was growing up, he was mischievous, and when he got old enough to drive and got serious about his driving, the most dedicated kid I've ever seen in my life.
When he was at a racetrack, he was a dream, he was a pleasure. He just lit up, and he shined, and he was happy.
For Adam and Kyle, racing became a bond that made them inseparable.
You'll hear Dad and Adam say sometimes that they really didn't look at each other more like a father or son, they looked at each other more like best friends, and they were, because they go to a racetrack, and from Wednesday to Sunday, that span is just them. They'd hang out on the bus, they'd watch races, they'd talk about race cars.
When he turned 17, this Petty rookie was ready for the big time. In 1998, he made his professional debut on the ASA circuit. Within 2 months, he became the youngest driver ever to win an ASA race.
10 years ago, I was just a kid in middle school, racing go-karts, and now I'm getting ready to make my first Winston Cup start in April, and everything's happening very fast.
Once again, a Petty father and son were racing together. And again, the Petty women carried the burden of support for them both.
I saw Adam race on Saturdays, and then I watched Kyle on Sundays. I don't know any other way, and I really wasn't afraid for them. I enjoyed watching them.
As the wife of one driver and the mother of another, Patty Petty needed her own source of strength. She found it in her family's tradition of prayer.
Every night, we would all say prayers before we went to bed. As a group, we'd pray for Adam and pray for myself and pray for Montgomery Lee to be safe when she rides horses, and for Austin as he travels around and took flying lessons and did stuff, and for Patty to look after all of us.
Adam's rapid ascent to stardom was staggering. On April 2nd, 2000, in a Winston Cup race at the Texas Motor Speedway, Adam became professional sports' first 4th generation athlete. 3 days later, the family's joy turned to grief. Lee Petty passed away at age 86. The family patriarch had lived just long enough to see his great-grandson drive in his first Winston Cup race.
That was a terrible loss, especially for Richard. He idolized his dad. So he was just really, really hurt when his dad was gone.
While the family mourned the loss of its first great champion, they remained full of optimism for Adam's future. On Mother's Day weekend, Adam headed to New Hampshire for his next race.
A lot of times I'd go with him, but this week just happened to be they were going to New Hampshire, which was an off week for the Winston Cup. So, I told him good luck, and I loved him, and I'd see him when he got back.
The next day, Patty was out running errands when she got a phone call.
My cell phone rang, and it was Jerry Freeze, who was his team manager, and he said there'd been an accident and that it wasn't good. But I'd never thought the worst.
On May 12, 2000, Adam was on a practice run at the New Hampshire International Speedway when his car hit the wall at the 3rd turn. Adam did not survive the crash.
It was a very, very emotional deal. 5 weeks before that, I just lost my father. And so, you know, we wasn't even over that.
We spent many hours talking and reading the Word and trying to make sense out of something that didn't make a lot of sense.
I can't put into words what I felt. You never realize how much somebody means to you until they're not around anymore.
I miss sharing a room together, laying in bed sometimes. We just sit there and stay up an hour and a half just talk.
We miss everything. I miss his smile, and that's what most people say they miss. He loved his father. I miss that most of all, I think, is seeing, being able to see how happy Kyle was with him.
I don't think you ever get over it. And it's like I've said before, I pray I never do get over it. You know, I pray every time I see his picture or that I hear his name that it hurts just as bad as it did the first time, because that's how much I loved him.
For the first time, Richard and Kyle reached out to each other for support. In the face of tragedy, their relationship grew stronger.
Since Adam's accident, there's not a time that goes by that we don't hang up the phone, that we don't tell each other we love each other. I think the same thing happened because he lost his father.
I'm trying to be, and I think I am a little bit more emotional with Kyle than what I was before, even though he's 40 years old. You know, maybe a little late to be showing that you love him, but I think he knows that.
Even with the family's love and support, it is still a struggle for Patty and Kyle to cope with Adam's death.
Nothing brings you the joy quite like it did when he was here. Days are a little longer now. I think it gets worse with time.
We're not the first family to ever lose a child, but I think for us it was a lot more public. That's been the plus and the minus. The plus has been the outpouring of grief from the fans and the support that we've gotten there. The minus has been that there's not a day goes by that you don't run into somebody who has something to say about it, so it's always there.
After the accident, the Pettys faced a difficult decision about how to best memorialize Adam.
Adam wanted to be a Winston Cup race car driver. When the accident happened halfway through this year, then we as a family sat down and talked, and it was like, do we let this dream die and what his dream was with him? And I think we talked about it and we said no. And if we kept it going, who was going to drive it? It became evident to all of us that the only person that they wanted to drive it was me.
It kind of eases my mom's and Austin's and my pain that he got in Adam's car.
Kyle spent the rest of the 2000 season driving Adam's car, working with Adam's team in the Busch Series. In 2001, he makes his son's dream come true by driving the number 45 car in the Winston Cup Series, the top circuit in NASCAR.
Well, once I started driving his car, then as far as I was concerned, I'm just a relief driver for the rest of my career. I'm just filling in where he was. In a lot of ways, he's still here. He'll always be with me.
Can't look back. You got to look forward. And you just try to get your family together and get everybody together and say, okay, you know, it's happened. Let's make the best out of it. You know, we'll never forget it. It's just been a terrible tragedy, but we'll just have to go on.
Coming up, racing's first family takes stock of its past and its future together.
On Fox Sports Net.
The Pettys are the only family in professional sports to have spanned 4 generations. Lee, Richard, Kyle, and Adam will all be remembered as great drivers on the track and as gentlemen off it.
If I am remembered, then that's enough. Because a lot of people have been a lot of things and nobody remembers them. At least if they remember you, you know you done your job.
The best part about our family, if you set 4 generations of us down and talk to the 4 of us, we were all 4 totally different people who just happened to love the same sport of auto racing.
The family's loss of Lee and Adam so close together has heightened the family's awareness of the values they hold most dear.
When you lose someone that you're very close to, you take a good look at life. Things that maybe you took for granted before, all of a sudden become very important to you.
From the humblest beginnings to fame and wealth, from the greatest glory to the most painful tragedies, the Pettys endure. 4 generations whose final legacy will be measured not by what they've done on the track, but by who they are as a family.
Maybe it's a Southern thing. I don't know, but you don't always get along with your brothers or sisters or your cousins, but your family. When it's all said and done, you know, that's what you have, family.
Why do you wear a cowboy hat?
He's the only guy in level cross that wears one.
In North Carolina, probably.
Yeah, North Carolina.
No, we'll just drive over there and